Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I am here tonight with Marisel Vera, who is the author of The Taste of Sugar. We are very excited to have this event as part of Agnes Scott College's Latinx Heritage Month celebration. That is a month-long series of events honoring the diverse, um, historical celebrations of freedom from countries all over Latin America and the Caribbean. And we wanted to start out our conversation with Marisel with a reading. I want to let folks know that if you want to say where you are watching from in the chat, you are welcome to do so. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a teal button that says Purchase the Taste of Sugar from Charis Books and More. I know you're going to want to buy this book as soon as you hear this conversation. You'll also see a ask a question button at the bottom of your screen. That is where you will obviously ask a question. It is not disruptive. You can put it in there at any time and we'll sort of weave it into our conversation. So if there are any questions that you have that we're not getting to, feel free at any point. But Marisel, thank you so much for being here. We are thrilled to have you. And yeah, I'm hoping you'll start out maybe with a bit from the beginning of the book, and then we'll move through various sections. But perhaps just give us a little taste of the beginning.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited, especially because the students are watching. So thank you. I want to just say that The Taste of Sugar follows the lives of a Puerto Rican couple at the turn of the 20th century. And at that time, Puerto Rico was a Spanish colony for 400 years already. And our young couple, when they marry and when they go up into the mountain to be small coffee farmers, have no clue that in a few years, there'll be the Spanish-American War, and the U.S. will invade Puerto Rico, and that a big hurricane, a hurricane similar to Hurricane Maria called San Ciriaco, would devastate Puerto Rico in a very similar manner to what Hurricane Maria did. And the results were very similar in 1899, like in 1917. So in the first piece that I would like to read, I want to introduce my first character, Valentina Sanchez. The novel is told in two voices, the woman's voice and the man's voice, because I like to get into people's heads. And I feel like especially during this period, the way that genders look at lives and at people, and it was just so completely different. And so for me, that's important to be able to write in both voices. So I'm going to read a very small section of Valentina's point of view, and then a little bit in Vicente, so you kind of get introduced to both characters. So this is chapter 2. French Mademoiselles, circa 1889. Before Valentina Sanchez met Vicente Vega, she was just a girl wishing for romance and adventure like in the French novels she loved. Her best friend, the wealthy Dalia, was to marry the Spanish caballero she met in Paris on a visit to a new exhibit called the Eiffel Tower. At night, it was lit by gaslight. It reached the clouds, Valentina. Valentina feared that the closest she would ever get to the Eiffel Tower was a drawing Dalia had sketched on the back of a missile. In the tiny bedroom of her parents' small house in Ponce, Valentina woke to the woodpecker's tap on a tree, to the footsteps of the tradespeople walking to La Plaza to sell their wares. The slant of morning sun sneaked in through the shuttered windows and caught her in the mosquito netting draped over her bed. Mama told her daughters not to complain because there were no trips abroad or fans of peacock feathers. Valentina and her sister Elena had food to eat, didn't they? They slept in beds with mosquito netting and not in doorways, didn't they? Did they notice the mother and her naked children sleeping on the steps of the alcaldía? Not even the mayor would help them. He said that he couldn't, because tax money went first to Spain, and then there was this town's sanitation, and on top of that, he had to pay the salaries of administrators, and then, bueno, always something. Listen to me, muchachas. Count your blessings like raindrops. Valentina's hometown of Ponce was a city of the very rich and the very poor, including many former slaves. Mostly, the poor worked for the rich in their grand houses. But there was also a tiny middle class to which Valentina's family belonged, mainly due to the family's connections on her mother's side, something that Mama reminded her husband as often as she deemed necessary. Mama was always economizando. She made do with a single servant, and a woman came just once a week to scrub the floors while she stood over her, supervising. Valentina's mother went daily to the market, cooked most of the meals, and mended the family's clothing with their daughter's help. La lavandera Claudia La Negra came with her children to collect the family's dirty laundry. The littlest child of 4 years carried a bundle of towels on her head with the care of an experienced laundress. Valentina had once heard her mother say that she didn't know how one person could eat, let alone feed a family on the earnings of a laundress. Everywhere they saw the indignities and tragedies that came from lack of money. When the girls accompanied their mother to the cemetery to say prayers at the graves of dead relatives, they often saw silent funeral processions of barefoot men carrying a plain 3-sided wood box balanced on long poles like a crude hammock, a black cloth thrown over the cadaver. The grave diggers would flip the coffin over a newly empty grave and dump the pauper's body head first. Beyond the marble mausoleums decorated with exquisite French porcelain roses, Elena led Valentina to an area surrounded by a wall of stone. Valentina, see over there? That's for los pobres. It's la huesera, the boneyard, where the skeletons are tossed to make room for more muertos. Chapter 3, Boyhood, circa 1880. Sometimes in whispers, Vicente and his brother Luisito called their father Raúl Vega, el general. His father's temper was infamous throughout the countryside. He often overheard people say that Raúl Vega tenía mal genio o un carácter fuerte. So whenever El General inflicted scorn that scarred their skin like the slash of the whip, his older brother's eyes bore into his, saying nothing. Raúl Vega had taught his sons that the way to know coffee was with your hands and your feet. When Vicente and Luisito were children, their father had set them under a bush to pick coffee berries. Vicente hadn't dared to complain about the mosquitoes and other insects that flew into his eyes and stuffed themselves up his nose. Evil branches scratched his face and tried to stop his picking. He dreamt of trees. When a tree asked him if he were a bird, Vicente observed the ghostliness of the moon, free to come and go as it pleased. Vicente whispered, "I am the moon bird." The tree whispered cuentos that the birds had brought back from other lands, tales of riches and pirates and oceans longer than days. A tree complained about the owl that kept it awake at night. Why didn't it fly down the mountain and bother those trees? The coffee trees wished that their taller cousins, the banana and plantain and guava trees, wouldn't hog up all the sunlight because they too wanted to bask in the sun. There was the eagle that perched in the crown of a tree with such delicacy. The swish of his massive wings as it flew away woke Vicente from his dream. Even Raúl Vega admitted that Vicente had the gift. Vicente's fingers need only touch the coffee berry for it to drop into his palm. He didn't mind that the berries didn't ripen all at once and that the trees must be picked over and over again during the harvest. He told his trees, "Your berries will be washed and dried and roasted to make coffee so delicious that it is a drink for the gods. Mere mortals will pay for it in gold and silver. Your berries will become coffee beans that will be transported in ships to faraway places I could never hope to see in this life or the next. Your berries will be transformed into coffee that will be served in the palaces of the most important people in the world, the kings and queens and popes. Your coffee will kiss the lips of the most beautiful señoritas and be served in cafes to idle people who will linger over tiny cups, bewitched. There are people in the world who could never live a day without you. Vicente never shared with others his conversations with the coffee trees, but it wasn't because he thought his brother Luisito would laugh at him or that his father might question his sanity. It was because it was between him and the trees. The trees liked the murmur of his voice, his words wrapped around their leaves as gentle as a nightly fog. When he ate dinner, his thoughts were the red coffee cherry, nestled in the green leaves, not the rice and beans and malanga, and not even when they had pollo fricassé, his favorite. He was back in La Finca, his gaze on the banana and plantain and guava shade trees, blessing their huge green fronds. When he examined the coffee cherries, he held his breath, exhaling only when he saw that they were healthy, that the lack of rain hadn't dried the berries, or that too much rain hadn't stripped the branches bare. When the green berries ripened, they would glisten on his palm like rubies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the things that I love about that, because those are the second and third chapters, is that, you know, we immediately get the sense of both of these characters as these kind of sensual dreamers, right? And I think one of the reasons that some people, contemporary readers, are not always immediately drawn to historical fiction is that they imagine that people who lived 100 years ago weren't as creative or sensual, or, you know, didn't have as rich of an inner life as we do today, right? And so I wonder if you could just share a little bit about how you began to imagine their inner lives.
Well, the way that I write is I think about what I want to say first, and then I think, who do I want to tell my story? So I thought, I want to write about Puerto Rico. I want to write about these historical events. So this is like my framework. You said some of your students are writers. So I think, right? So I think they would be interested in this. So then I think this is like my framework. I don't necessarily think in plots. I like to believe that my characters will tell me their story. So then once I thought, this is what I had to say, this is my framework, I want to write about this period. I knew that I wanted to write in a woman's voice, and I wanted to write in a man's voice, and I try to be equal, give them equal time. And with Valentina, I thought of what are the options for a young woman who's 17 years old in Puerto Rico in 1889 or 18, yes, what are her choices? She's not super wealthy. Even if she were super wealthy, most likely she won't be able to get an education. Most likely she'll have to get married. She's not really wealthy. She's not going to get to travel. What does she want? I imagine this young girl who wanted more than she was destined for. So I put myself in her place. As a writer, I always think when I'm going to write about Valentina, I think today I'm going to write about Valentina as a 17-year-old girl. And so I try to think of, by then I usually have done research, so I kind of have an idea of how the world is at that time. If not, then I'll do it while I'm working. And I also know the world of the Puerto Rican culture because I grew up in it. And I think it had to be worse in Valentina's age than my time growing up, and it was already bad enough. So I'm like, she's got all these things. She's not going to be able to do this. She's not going to be able to do that. So that you want that as a writer. You want especially the beginning, you don't want the person that you're writing about to get their wish granted, because then where's the story? So that's what I was thinking about Valentina. She's 17 years old. What does she want? She wants to go to Paris. She has a friend who is having her dream. She wants that dream too. What happens? She meets Vicente. Where's Vicente? Who is he? A small coffee farmer who works for his father. He doesn't even have his own farm. So already there's a problem. And what does Vicente want? Vicente wants to have his own farm. But it's not so easy to have your own farm when you don't have money. And so that's a problem. Money is a problem. From the beginning, in the prologue in the first chapter, I make it clear that these two characters do not come from money. They are just trying to make ends meet, but they still have dreams. And I think that's something that young people, you always think that, oh, your parents were boring, your parents had these whatever kind of lives, but maybe if you ask your parents questions, they might be a lot cooler than you. I mean, really, it's possible. So these, and I know, like, for one thing that I gave Valentina, I gave her something from my own mother. My mother grew up in this mountain in Puerto Rico, not the same area that Valentina grew up, but she grew up in a mountain in the 1930s and the 1940s, no electricity like Valentina, and she didn't like it because it's like, what are you going to do? There's no, that time there wasn't a car, you couldn't go into the town, you're in a mountain. What do you do? And so I'm like, wow, here. And my mother ended up living in Chicago for a lot of years. And really, she had like the city blood in her because she loved to go to museums and restaurants and stuff. But I'm thinking, poor Valentina, she's on this mountain. She came from this town where she got to do things. And now she's up there. Okay, she fell in love, but love, is love the answer to everything when everything else is not going well? Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And I think, you actually answered in many ways some of the other questions I had around sort of plotting and things like that. I think, so your first novel is also a historical novel, but set in the mid 20th century. And I was curious, so I have not read your first novel, but I was curious about how you researched that novel, which I would imagine you could just talk to. There are people who are alive that you could talk to about that, versus your novel, which is set at the end of the 19th century, and how the research for those two books was different.
Well, what was interesting was I learned about the Puerto Ricans who went to Hawaii while I was conducting research for my first novel. I stumbled upon that fact. I don't know what I was. The 1950s was a period when my parents came separately to Chicago to work in the factories, and that was part of a government-sanctioned exodus called Operation Bootstrap in English, Manos de Obra in Spanish. And basically, bad shit is going on in Puerto Rico. Too difficult to fix employment. That'll take money investing. We don't want to do that. Let's push them out. They could, So that's kind of what happened. And that's what happened in the Taste of Sugar. The Taste of Sugar, I learned in my research, was the first government-sanctioned exodus of Puerto Ricans for similar reasons that happened in the 50s with Operation Bootstrap. So I'm like, oh my God. And Operation Bootstrap, I was able, like you said, I was able to ask my mother some questions. I did a lot of research. I asked my godmother questions, other people questions, and also their answers not only informed that novel, but also informed this new novel, because the feelings of desire and aspiration, it doesn't matter what century you're in, everybody has it, and the lack of opportunity, hungry people, throughout the whole 19th and 20th century. So it was really interesting that it's sort of like my work informs, in general, it informs, anything I learn informs my work in general.
That's great. That I think also a hopeful thing for people who are writers, like research is lost. Like if it doesn't get into
I don't think so.
Like maybe I'll get into the next one.
The interesting thing about research, you end up doing like, I don't know, 75% more research than you need And sometimes I will take notes, and I tend to mark up my nonfiction books. I will never mark up my fiction books. For me, they're like sanctified, and I don't. I never have, and I never will. But I do it for nonfiction books because there are things, underline, and then I'll write some notes. But I've noticed that I will retain what I need. And that's something as a writer that you grow with, that confidence. The more that you write, you will find that what you need comes to you, or maybe it doesn't, and it's just something you can go look at. So that's something as a beginning writer, I promise you, it'll come to you.
I have. You're the second author I've heard say that actually the research that doesn't stick in your brain will probably stand out as artificial on the page if you try and shoehorn it in there, and that the research that sticks with you is the right research and right material for your story. So I want to go back to the residences of the hurricane, which we'll talk, maybe we'll read a little bit about the hurricane, but so Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in 2017 along with several other places in the Caribbean. And I think for a lot of people who were raised in the mainland US were really, that was the first time that many people paid attention to the mainland US's relationship to Puerto Rico, really started to learn the history of US territories, and really started to reckon with how horrible that the history of the US's relationship with Puerto Rico is. And I know for me, I was not educated at all about it in elementary school. It wasn't until I went to college that I even really understood the difference between, for example, Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and the similarities. So I wonder, you grew up in Chicago, and I wonder if you could say a bit about kind of what you learned as a child in your formal sort of school education about colonialism in Puerto Rico, and then sort of how that meshed with your own, family education about that, and then how your research, how all the pieces kind of came together for you.
Well, the one thing that I remember, I had honors history, and there was maybe a paragraph about Puerto Rico in high school, like it was a Commonwealth of the United States. That's what it said. And Puerto Ricans are American citizens. That's it. And when I asked my parents about Puerto Rico, they also said it was a Commonwealth. They didn't use that word Commonwealth. They use Estado Libre Asociado. That's the Spanish way of saying it. And that is actually what happened was in 1952, after World War II, the United Nations was saying, if you're a democratic country, you have colonies, you can't have colonies. So Puerto Rico and the United States worked a deal out. The person who was governor, Muñoz Marin, they worked out this deal to call it Estado Libre Asociado, or Commonwealth. And what Puerto Rico got out of it was more control at home over their political choices. And what the U.S. got out of it was they no longer had a colony, they had a Commonwealth. But here's the thing, with Promesa, the bill that was signed by President Obama, that's been taken away. Now Puerto Rico has no control over anything political. And it's really important because, like, when the COVID started, the governor and people were like, let's close the airports in Puerto Rico, keep it contained. But they had no power to do that. Only the federal government had that power, so they didn't close the airports. Now Puerto Rico's suffering a lot because of COVID. People kept on going there for their little vacations. What I really felt the lack, getting back to your question, I really felt the lack of not knowing what it meant to be Puerto Rican, because in growing up in Chicago, I was Puerto Rican in some places, I was American in others. And what did that mean? I as an artist, you tend to live a double consciousness anyway. And you live it when you live in two different cultures and you don't know why. It's important to know why. For me, anyway, it was important to know why, so that I could have a foundation. I could live less on quicksand, maybe. And I was talking to my sisters about this, and they were saying how it would help them. And it's only just recently where we feel like we know who we are and why we're here, because of what we've learned. And the reason that we didn't know is not because our parents were dumb or anything. It's because it was intentional erasure by the United States government. And that's what happens when you're a colony. You have no control even over your history. And if you don't know your history, then you don't get to think about, you can't really think, oh, wow, this is, maybe I should do this. That's not fair. And you won't agitate for change. Some people do know, but most people don't. And the reason people who are not Puerto Ricans don't know anything about Puerto Rico is for that reason. It's not taught in the history books. So that's why people were shocked. People are still shocked. Are Puerto Ricans Americans? Why? They weren't Americans during this time of the taste of sugar. After the U.S. invasion, they still didn't become Americans because the United States government saw Puerto Ricans as others, brown people, and they didn't want us to be part of the Americans. So they soon afterwards they started, and the Supreme Court made up some new laws, and basically Puerto Rico, even now, belongs to the United States, but it is not a part of the United States. That's actually the language still. Hawaii and Alaska during that time were also territories, but they were different because they were settler colonies. That means that white Americans could go there and settled. And once there were enough white Americans there, they could petition to become states. But that's not the case. That wasn't the case for Puerto Rico. It was already inhabited by people with a culture and their own language. A lot of people, not that Alaska and Hawaii didn't have their own culture and their own language, but there were less people. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really crucial difference that a lot of people are a lot of white people and Black and brown Americans who are born in the mainland, I think really often don't know the difference between settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism. It's like who was here and how much sort of cultural infrastructure was pre-existing. That was something that I really didn't learn until very recently, and I think that shows up in the novel. So maybe that's a good segue to talk about. So this program, basically, so 5,000 people leave to go farm on Hawaii, and that's this first iteration of in this program that your parents were a part of later. So
yes,
similar, yeah. So could you maybe share a little bit about how that functions in the novel, and then also maybe about kind of the political point behind that.
Well, what really intrigued me was when I found out about these 5,000 Puerto Ricans. I thought, oh my God, did they ever get to come back? How could they possibly come back? Even now going to Hawaii, you're like, you have to go all the way to California, then you have to take another flight. And if you go to another island, it's like, it takes time. And at that time, I'm like, how do they do it? Well, boat, train across the United States from New Orleans to San Francisco, then a boat, then another boat. And so how could they come back? How would they have the money? So that really intrigued me. And I thought, wow, I'm sure some of them wanted to come back and couldn't. Some people will make new lives and they'll be okay with it, but some people want to come back. And I always think about my father when I write this type of story. about characters wanting to come back, because what my father always wanted to do was go back to Puerto Rico, buy a little land, build a little house on the mountain where he grew up, and have a finca, grow coffee, have chickens, and he never got to do that. He died pretty young as a result, I feel, of the fumes and the things like that he had to endure working in factories. And so that gives me a lot of understanding and empathy for people who want to return to wherever their home is and they can't, because maybe for whatever reason they couldn't get the money to go back. You think, okay, like my characters, Vicente is like, we'll come back in 3 or 4 years, and I'll be able to buy that. That farm, we'll have this dream, and you hold on to that dream because maybe you have to hold on to that dream. So that for me is just so bittersweet, and it has so much layering, and is so intriguing as a writer, and I just want to explore it. And that's why I needed Vicente. And I needed Vicente's brother also, because I wanted to write. At one point I thought, when I start a new novel, I think what I want to say is so big. I want to say so much. I don't know if I can do it. And I felt like that with the first novel. I didn't know if I could do what I wanted to do, but I took it one thing at a time, and I was able to do it. So when this kind of fear and insecurity came to me with this novel, I'm like, you did it before, you can do it again. Just take this. And I was telling somebody that I feel like it's like building a cathedral. How to me that's like the highest type of architecture, edifice, or whatever you can. And so you just start with, one day it's a stained glass, you do the stained glass. So one day I'll write in Valentina's voice about this event. Another day I'll write in Vicente's voice about this event. And then I wanted to write about colorism, racism in the novel. So I need a Black character. And so that's why I gave Vicente a Black brother. And I also wanted to write about how, and once the Puerto Ricans got to Hawaii, they didn't care about separating the families. They would send one to one island. This really happened. And send people to another island, and they never saw each other again. Or maybe they did. Sometimes they did, and sometimes it wasn't even them. Sometimes it was the second generation that found somebody from the first generation who was a member of their family. So then, so I have to create. I figure out what I need, and I create these worlds and put people in them. Ask people, I guess, to come in them and to help me tell my story. And there was a second part to your question, which was, what was it?
What was it? I'm so taken with your answer. I think, just the political underpinning. So I was just saying, so how does it work in a novel, and then what was the political underpinning? But I think you basically answered that. Do you want to read a little bit from the sort of middle part of the book?
Sure. Should I read a little bit of? I really, the part of the hurricane that I love more than anything. Of course, I love every word, but the part that I love more than anything, I really love the part where Raulito is with his mother. I just like, one thing that your writers, it's important. This is important for your writers. If when you're writing, you don't feel it, if you're not crying when your readers are crying, or you're not crying because you do some bad shit to your character, your readers aren't going to care either. You have to feel it for your readers to feel it. That's the kind of writing. I strive to do that kind of writing. I don't know that I'm always successful, but I really try for that. So when this killed me when I wrote this part. So I'm going to read it.
Excellent.
It's on page 190, in case anybody's following me. Raulito clutched his mother Eusemia's hands as they sat huddled together on the cot. It reminded him of how, as a small boy, his mother had carried him to her bed when he had woken up crying about spirits. He was forever dreaming about spirits. It didn't help that Eusebia often saw her dead relatives, her mother and father and grandparents, wandering the mountainside or next to her when she picked coffee. His mother had explained that the spirits had once been human beings, but because of terrible tragedies they had suffered when they were alive, they couldn't make their way into the spirit part of the world. There is only one world, Eusebia has said. Everyone lives in it, the living and the dead. Raulito had cried because he didn't want to live with his dead relatives. The spirits meant him no harm, his mother had reassured him, but they were among them always, whether he wanted them to be or not. Now he pledged to protect his mother, this woman whose hands were rough like bark. Rain came through the thatch roof. His eardrums felt as if they would burst. Hours later, when the wind abated, his ears popped, and he clutched his head in pain. Mother and son stood outside their bohío, staring in silent horror. The few trees that remained had been snapped like kindling. The huge mango tree from which Eusebia had picked mangoes for Vicente's mother the day before, gone. Many of the bohíos had vanished. Some of their neighbors drifted in dazed circles or ran around in a crazed state, towards what or away from what, it was impossible to tell. Later, Raulito would realize that the people were naked. The wind picked up again, and they returned to their home of straw and plaited palm. Raulito reached for his mother's hands again. He was sure that the terror on her face was reflected in his own. He fought against the scream that rose in his throat, even though no one could hear it. The rain came down in furious waves and carried off the hut's thatch roof. Water gushed down over them like a waterfall. He felt himself lifted up. When Raulito was a small boy, his father, Raul Vega, picked him up and tossed him high up in the air, and he flew up, up, up. Raulito flew up into the sky.
Ooh. Yes. So, have you ever been in a hurricane? That was one thought I had.
No, but you know what? I don't need to be, because that's the gift that writers have. You don't need to be. But I have been to Puerto Rico. I do have a love for Puerto Rico. And yeah, I don't need to be. I've been in blizzards, tornadoes, so the terror, I think, is the same. But yeah.
I think that terror of losing connection with your family, like your loved one and being separated, I think that's a universal fear. And so I think tapping into that.
I want to say that one of my friends, Puerto Rican friends, Mercedes, did live through the hurricane, Hurricane Maria, and she read the book and I got the okay from her. It was a really intense, but I got the okay. I'm like, good, because it's too late now. But what I read, this is what helped me with the hurricane. I came upon this book that I never thought I was going to get. But one of my friends who's a professor, one of her students ordered this one book. This was probably not illegal, but she requested this one book that was printed in 1900. And it had, from Puerto Rico, from the library in Puerto Rico. And when she got it, she Xeroxed it and she made her a copy. She made me a copy. So I have that book. And what's in the book is that every single municipality in Puerto Rico, there's a report about what happened in every municipality. So I studied that book, and some of those details I hear. Nothing about what happened in the Hurricane San Ciriaco that's in this book is fiction, except the part that's fiction is Raulito's. It happened to Raulito, it happened to my characters, but what they saw afterwards, that's real. What the newspaper articles said, that's real.
That's amazing. I think one of the things that I really love about this book is, so often in the United States, when there's conversations about immigration and migration, it's very it's a very simple conversation in ways that don't match reality. So the reasons why people choose to leave their home country are very often related to natural disasters, right? Are related to, things very much outside of everyone's control. And as global warming continues, that is only going to likely get worse. And I am really interested in the idea of like how little we talk about environmental. I mean, obviously people who are smart about immigration talk about environmental factors all the time, but that is not a part of the general conversation around major reasons why people leave their homes. Is that the physical environment can no longer sustain life safely, right? And so I wonder if you thought about trying to illustrate that, as a part of an immigration story as you are writing this.
Yes, yes, yes. And what happened with Hurricane Maria was the infrastructure was not up to code because the government, the Puerto Rican government, was using the money that really should have been used to repair bridges and the infrastructure to pay the debt, the legal debt that is owed to Wall Street. And in this, and the taste of sugar infrastructure was no good either because the money was going to Spain. And also just because of Spain, for their taxes, and also the Spain is preparing for war with the United States government. So the money that should be used for infrastructure and for employment for the people and to feed the people is used for things like the horses for the soldiers, the uniforms, and send the money to Spain. And with her, so it's so similar. The infrastructure, 3 years after Hurricane Maria, the infrastructure is still bad. I talked to one of my aunts a few weeks ago. There is still, and it's in the newspaper articles, there are still people living under blue tarps from Hurricane Maria. It's really hard to get your money approved to fix your house. You bring all the documents. Hopefully you have documents and they weren't lost in the hurricane. You bring your documents and it's not good enough for whatever reason. And if you're approved, maybe you're part of the 5% or something. Let's say you need $40,000 to restore your house. Maybe you get 11. That's not enough. You can't do your house. Can you imagine if that happened to you? So it's still the same. God forbid that there is another hurricane. The two political candidates right now have for president have promises for Puerto Rico. There was money that Congress allotted for Puerto Rico, and not all, like only a third of it was given. It's still here. When is that? And oh man, it's just like.
Yeah. Regine in the comments says, right, there's an important dimension of the natural disasters that is man-made. We see this in Haiti and New Orleans as well as in PR. Yeah, that's so right on. And I think and globally, the rising temperatures in various places that, cause people to move and then get into, border conflicts. That's true everywhere. It's like, but also that border is fictive, right? Like that's all made up. So
and now, what's happening in Puerto Rico, what happened in Puerto Rico, and it happens in a lot, and happened during the period of the Taste of Sugar disaster. What's it called? I want to say not disaster economy, disaster. I'm sorry?
Disaster capitalism?
Disaster capitalism. Yes, I had that in my head. Disaster capitalism, because what happened then? Okay, so because of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. invasion, the hurricane, and also the tax structure is different. When Americans come in, well, people lose their farms. Who wants their farm? Capitalists. one of the
Yep.
governors of Puerto Rico was a governor, an American from Wall Street, was a governor for less than a year. By the time he left, he had huge sugar plantations, and he went to Wall Street, and he had his, he did a conglomerate of Americans, owning most of the land. So what's happening now in Puerto Rico? More or less the same thing. Puerto Ricans have to leave because there's no work, and to come here to the United States to work. And who's moving in? Isn't it like, the Bitcoin people? Bitcoin? Those people are the ones moving in.
Yeah. Which is absolutely what happened in New Orleans, right? I mean, that was 100% what happened in New Orleans, that it was rich white people who then came in and bought up all the land.
And the Puerto Rican government made it very easy for Americans like you. You could go, possibly me, but for you, sure you could go to Puerto Rico right now, start your own company, and pay 4% tax, maybe. Yes, wow. It's like the best place for American citizens. So that's why they're going in there, building gated communities.
So, I mean, the thing, I saw one reviewer called this book, sort of a contemporary Grapes of Wrath. And I thought that was a really lovely comparison in terms of the scope of this book, and also the macro and the micro, right? And one of the things that I thought was really important is, you're sort of inviting us in through this love story. And I think some people will read this book and only care about the love story, and then sort of by osmosis learn this history and these politics. And then some people will care about the politics and then begin to care about the love story, right? I mean, your characters, we immediately care about the characters, but and you've already sort of shared with us that you knew what you wanted to write about, and then you found the people who could help you say what you wanted to say. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the utility of telling love stories when you have a message, and maybe if that as a strategy to get your point across.
Well, I think that it's because I'm a fiction writer. And if I wanted just to write about the historical point of view, then I would write nonfiction. But because I'm a fiction writer, and especially a novelist, novels are about people. So that's something that for your young writers to remember. You're writing about people. There are some novels that aren't about people, but my favorite novels are about people. And I love a love story. It doesn't have to be all a love story, but I like a little bit of a love story. And in Taste of Sugar, I try to give, I feel like there are different love stories in the novel. And I think that when you're writing about terrible things, the writer too, but the reader needs some kind of relief. It can't be all tragedy. Just like in our lives now, there's bad stuff happening, but we have, I hope, these moments of love, somebody that we love, talking to someone who makes us laugh or something, and that gives us the ability to continue, to go on and to do the best that we can whenever we can. And that's why I think love stories are important. With Valentina and Vicente, they have in the beginning like an infatuation. They don't really know each other. They're young, but with what happens to them in their lives, they grow to really care about each other. And that is the strength that they have in the novel, how they have each other. And that helps them to bear things that we hope we don't ever have to bear. And also together, it helps them to dream, they each have these dreams that whether or not they come true, I don't know, but they still have these dreams, and they sort of, in a way, they kind of like encourage each other's dreams. Although Vicente never encourages Valentina's dream to go to Paris.
No.
Not ever. That's his big flaw, I think.
Yeah. He seems to think that's a bridge too far. But, so in terms of, on a very literal level, how do you keep track of your characters? Because there's this kind of sweeping narrative, and we have the micro emotional story of the two of them, and all these other characters. How do you keep track literally on the page as you're kind of building the cathedral that you talked about? Do you have a document where you are like, okay, here's this scene and I'm going to plug it in here? Or how do you literally move stuff around?
I start writing with a pen and paper.
Oh, wow. Old school.
Especially if I'm starting something fresh, I have the pen and the paper, and I start writing. I'll write like a paragraph or two. Sometimes if I'm in the zone, I'll write several pages, but then I stop because I have to read my handwriting, and I'm going to put it back in. I'm going to put that into my computer. But the way I did it was basically I took, like this type of, this is my writing, and I'll do like a timeline. I did the dates, and I would put when, okay, they're going to go in this period, 1899, they meet, or this person is born, 1903, they're here. And so that wasn't so confusing, but what really confused me was I had a lot of minor characters. So sometimes I had to write their name down or double check that I didn't use that name that I liked with somebody else. That gave me just a little bit of difficulty. And one thing that I strive to do is to make every person that I write about sound different from somebody else. And that's like my own personal challenge to myself, and it's hard. And with the minor characters, I try to do it with one sentence. And I learned that from Chekhov's short stories. I'm a huge fan of all of Chekhov's short stories. So with just one sentence, he was able to describe a particular person. I know, like The Peasants is one of my favorite short stories that he wrote. I really empathize with I don't know if you ever read that, with the waiter in town who's in the city doing well. Then he dreams about living in the country, and then he becomes sick. So he has to go to the country, to his old family home with his wife and child. And it's not what the idyllic remembrance that he remembers is terrible. And so that kind of stuff is what I love. So I learned from that. And so I strive to do that, to use one sentence to describe, like the people on the boat. When we were on the boat, when we were in steerage, I tried to use one sentence for each person that talked, so that to help the reader think about that, remember that person later. Oh, that person did this. That woman grew up next to the cemetery, or whatever.
How much, so for people, the characters that are sort of in between that, right? Like, so characters who are not our protagonists, and not, we meet them once, maybe twice, but sort of that middle ground. How much backstory do you write for them that may or may not go into the book? Like, do you do a real deep dive, or do you kind of just start out and see how much you might need and write it on the spot?
Well, it just depends, because I wish I was very disciplined like that, and I try to be, but it just depends. Like with Angelina, Vicente's mother, I had written a lot of stuff of hers once to try to discover her. But Inez, I didn't write anything about her. Okay. When Angelina met her, she became clear to me. Later on, I saw little things of her later on. I learned later on that she was good at Mundillo. I learned later on that she had a daughter who had died. You know, I didn't know any of these things. A lot of times, which is what I love, that the characters reveal things to me as I'm writing them. Often I'll just think, today I'm going to write about Valentina, and she's going to go to the cemetery with her mother and her sister. So I've been to cemeteries in Puerto Rico before. I know how they are and how the stones are. And I learned about throwing the skeletons, tossing it over the side. So I imagine Valentina, she's 12, 13, 14 years old, and she's seeing this. How does she feel? How does it look? You know, and then sometimes I close my eyes so that I could get a feel for the atmosphere of how it is. You know, imagine myself there. And so that's how I learned things. Elena, her sister, I wanted Valentina to have a sister. I try not to give my main characters too many siblings, because then I have to write about them, and I might not want to. So I gave her a sister. And Elena was very important, because I named her after one of my very good friends, Elena, who I saw as a practical, kind, compassionate person. She is practical, kind, and compassionate. And I saw Elena as that, because Elena is going to be helping Valentina a lot in her life. And I needed Valentina to have someone that she was close to write letters to her, and that she could write letters to, because I wanted to send somebody to someone. And my characters could not go there because I have to be stuck on a mountain. So I'm like, okay, so Elena has to go there. And they write letters to each other. And this way, as Valentina learns what's going on in someone, the reader does too. And for me, that was very important, because there were things, political things happening that Elena, Valentina and Vicente knew a lot of things because of the newspapers, but there were things that they told each other that they might not have been able to know, except through the letters. And I also wanted to show that the love, this book has a lot of tragedy, but it also has a lot of love with the characters. There's love of country, there's love of land, especially for Vicente. He's so connected to the land, and to have to leave his farm, I mean, it's a heartbreak. It's as hard for him as it is for Valentina to have to leave her family. But there's a lot of love in the book, and I wanted to have her sister there and someone.
I think that's one of the, thinking about, like, okay, what information do my characters need? What information does my reader need? And then what are all the creative ways that I can get this in there? I mean, I think that's always kind of exciting. It's sort of like a puzzle to figure out. So that's interesting to hear about. So you mentioned Chekhov, who I shamefully have not, I think I maybe read one story at some point, but I am not familiar at all with Chekhov. But can you share some of your perhaps more classical influences, and then your contemporary influences? So maybe just a couple like old school faves and contemporaries.
Well, I really like Edith Wharton. I thought that she could write women extremely well, which is amazing considering she was such a wealthy woman. And she didn't have to put herself in the life of somebody like in The House of Mirth, Lee Bart, who lives kind of like Valentina in an external world that's a lot wealthier than her means. And she strives to be part of that world, and it doesn't turn out well. So I'm really impressed with Edith Wharton. Love her a lot. Let's see. I, of course, have read Steinbeck. Faulkner influenced me a lot. I learned a lot of things from Faulkner. I really like As I Lay Dying. Something about that book just really, I think, breaks my heart. And I love books that break my heart. And I love Fitzgerald because I think his language is so beautiful, and language is very, very important to me. if the language in the book is not beautiful, I don't want to read it. Unless it's like, well, not that nonfiction books are not beautiful, but when it comes to fiction, the language has to be beautiful. In this novel too, a book that meant something to me that's contemporary. Well, it was contemporary to me, but I think it was written in the 1950s by a Japanese writer, and that's the Mikiyoko sisters. I'm not sure if I pronounced it properly. My two main Japanese characters are named for the two of the main characters in that novel. I really thought it was so beautiful. I like books in translation a lot, and when especially when the language is still beautiful in English, it's just like, wow. I'm sure it's beautiful in their language, but to have it be beautiful in English, that's like an incredible accomplishment. So this book is a contemporary book, really beautiful. One book that really influenced me a lot is Dreaming in Cuban by Cristina Garcia. Because until I read that book in 1993 when it came out, I didn't think that I could be a novelist. It was never anything that I really seriously considered that I could do, because I never saw anybody like myself in books when I was growing up. And I have been reading since I was 7 or 8 years old. And I never saw myself. And because I loved novels, fiction in general, short stories, I love poetry too, but especially novels so much. I thought that the writers of novels were gods and goddesses. I mean, here I was, a girl, Puerto Rican girl growing up in Humboldt Park. My father worked in a factory. I couldn't write that. I couldn't write a novel. I never thought, I knew I had writing talent, and I did writing work in my career. But for me, the novel was like, and then when I read Dreaming in Cuban, and Cristina is my contemporary, I thought maybe I can. And at that moment in my life, I just had my daughter. I was willing to, I think when you have a child, I mean, your life changes. I was just willing to try. I'm like, I'm going to try. I don't know if it'll ever happen, if I'll ever be able to do this great big thing, but I'm going to try. And so Cristina, she doesn't know. She knows I've taken her workshop and now she's my friend, but I don't know if she knows how much, she really influenced me.
Well, and that's so much of, why at Charis we carry the books that we carry, because really our imaginations are limited by who we see on the shelves. And so often, if you don't see someone like you, it can be really hard to imagine that can be a creative life that you could have. So we are grateful to her for offering that possibility to you, because this is such a lovely book. And the last question I want to ask you is just, your website said that you're at work on a third novel. I don't know, some writers are superstitious and don't like to jinx themselves, but if there's anything you can,
everything.
Okay, great. If you want to talk about it, we'd love to hear anything you want to say about it.
Well, this book, I grew up in this area in Chicago, this neighborhood called Humboldt Park. And so this novel is about 4 girls growing up in Humboldt Park during the period that I grew up in the 1970s in Chicago. It's an important period because my generation was a first generation really of teenagers in Chicago who were Puerto Rican, and people didn't care for that. They called us thugs and things like that. And during that period, there was a lot of social unrest in the 70s. There was a riot in one day. There was a Puerto Rican parade festival in Humboldt Park, and cops killed 2 Puerto Rican men. And that caused, people started rioting, a week long of rioting, because of all the injustice that the community has suffered since the early 60s. And I want to also write about their parents, because there's so much bad stuff. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to write about their parents, because in the almost 10 years before, there was another, more police killings and more riots. So I want to write about those, some of those parents. And not only can I write about that, but I want to write about, let's say, one of the fathers who would have come to Chicago around the time of my father, and who came into work in one of the government-sponsored programs, and terrible things happened. So I can write about that, and how maybe I'll write one of the mothers, how she came in the program where she worked as a servant. I just recently read in this one book about this Puerto Rican woman in 1954 who came to work as a maid in somebody's house. Well, her boss, a white woman in Chicago, let go of her cook, her nursery maid, and the housekeeper. And then this woman was going to do all three of those jobs. And they were getting paid something like $60 a month. In the newspapers of that period, servants and houses got paid $45 a week. They were getting paid $60 a month. And if you think that's bad, the money from the airfare coming from Puerto Rico to Chicago was deducted. Half of it was deducted from their salary. And if you think that's bad, some of their salary money to go back to Puerto Rico was also deducted from their salary. So how much did they make? I haven't figured out the math yet. So, you know, there are all these things. And of course, there will be love triangles, because that's life and that's fun to write about. And there'll be joy, there'll be a lot of music, because just like in A Taste of Sugar, there's a lot of music. I grew up with a lot of music in my culture. And that's one thing about the Puerto Ricans who went to Hawaii. They took their music, and there's this one type of musical instrument that, I don't know if you've seen it, you kind of like grate and guido like this. The music that they call it kachi kachi music in Hawaii, because it sounds like that. So the generation of Puerto Ricans and other Puerto Rican Hawaiians, they play the kind of music. You look it up.
That's awesome. Well, that sounds amazing, and I like that we're getting all these different pieces of history as you move around in fiction. So I will eagerly await that one. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to? Is there anything that
well, are there any questions from the writers?
I prompted them, but people seem to be pretty shy tonight.
Well, okay. Writing advice?
Oh yeah, great.
Okay. You have to, if you have a story to tell, only you can tell that story, and you have to write it, and you have to not worry about the external part of writing. Don't worry about whether you get published. Don't worry about whether you get an agent. Don't worry about any of that, because you can't control it. The only thing that you can control is your own work. And so do the best you can, read other people's work. And even if you don't like the book, that's good, because you can analyze it. Why didn't it work? If you like the book, that's good too. Why did it work? What did I like about it? And like, I don't have an MFA, nothing against MFAs, but I don't have one. So I kind of learned, I took a couple workshops, and I learned, and revise, embrace revision. I love revision. You don't know how many drafts I wrote for The Taste of Sugar. You can't imagine. I don't know, 50? I have no idea. But you have to love it, because it's hard, just like the arts. It's a tough world, and you really have to do it because you feel you want to say something so much that you're willing to give the time and the sacrifice that you have to give to do it, and dream, because why not?
Yes, that's all great advice. Thank you. Do you want to read one last section to kind of close us out?
Do you have a favorite section?
Oh man. Now we have a question. Regine asks, thank you for this wonderful talk. How can you tell the difference between a novel idea, book-length idea, and a short story idea? That's a great question.
I think that sometimes you can't tell. I think if you have an idea, start writing it. And if you go past 20 pages and you feel like you have so much more to say, then maybe that's a novel idea. Because usually short stories are in that, time frames of 20 pages. And if you have a lot of themes, might not be a short story idea. Maybe it could be a novella. I don't know if novellas are harder to sell. It's already difficult to sell. So maybe, but I think that you should just start working on it, and you'll know if you've worked on it for a while and you're like, oh, but I wanted to bring that character in and I would do this and I don't want to cut this because it's so important. Well, then maybe it's a novel. You'll get a feel for it. You just keep working on it and you'll get a feel. And it's okay to ask people to read your work, but you have to be careful with that. You have to ask people who you trust that aren't going to want to rewrite it. And hopefully you, maybe if you have a writing class, you get a feel for other people's work and how they give you feedback. Because you don't want someone who sometimes I know that I've heard from other writers of color that the other people in the room don't get what they're trying to say because they don't live in those worlds. And so that's something to be aware of and to take with a grain of salt. I always encourage somebody to take a fiction class because then it gives you deadlines. You got to turn in something by this time. And discipline is very important as a writer. You have to make yourself sit down to write. It's very hard. I found it so difficult in the beginning. It gets easier, and especially when you're feel enthusiastic about your work, it gets easier. But you have to carve out whatever works for you, an hour a day, whatever. One thing that I learned from Christina Garcia, and that's very helpful to me, and I have to say, I never get writer's block. And one thing that I do is I read a lot of poetry before I start working. Depending on what I'm working on, like if I'm writing something about Puerto Rico, I might read a Puerto Rican poet. Or if I'm writing something about factories, I read Philip Levine a lot when I was working on factories because he used to work in a factory. He was a welder. My father was a welder. For the first novel, I read a lot of his work. I got a really good feel for the working man in an industrial way. But if I'm writing about love or if I'm writing about flowers or whatever, there are a lot of really great poets that I love now, like Patricia Smith is a particular favorite of mine. So I read poetry like about 3 pages, and Christina taught us that you read a poem and you underline words or phrases that click with you, intrigue you. And then you write them in a separate notebook. So if you're stuck, you open up your notebook and you look at the things that you have written, and something there might give you an idea for something that you wanted to write. Another thing Christina said was like photographs. Look at a photograph that might give you an idea about something you want to write. And also listen. I don't know, did the person ask me for writing advice? Listen to the way people talk, always. I always do. I listen to the way people talk because everyone has a different rhythm with the way they talk. And that helps you with your characters because you want to, ideally, you don't want to have to say Valentina in the top so then the people know, okay, this is Valentina, the reader knows Valentina's writing. I really worked hard not to do that. I don't know if I was successful, but like that. So the listening to the way people talk and analyzing it, and that's where poetry is also good. As a writer, you have to analyze everything. That's your job. Your job is to see, to hear, and to think. If you can't think, I don't know how you could write. You got to be able to think critically. Of course, you need the other senses, smell, and everything else, but.
I see Rafael Ocasio, who is a professor at Agnes Scott and also a writer as well, and he has a recent book out of Puerto Rican folklore. So he's somebody who folks should know if this is an area of interest for you. He said, "Thanks for a great talk. My paternal grandfather from Manatee was almost drafted to go to Hawaii in the early 1910s because he had experience growing pineapples." So that's interesting. And I think it's people's family history is so important in these stories, and I think the more we can talk to our ancestors and even just find out if your parents are still alive, or older aunts and uncles and cousins and stuff, getting snippets of this if you're a writer, so that you can. I was just talking to my mother today just about her grandma and about the way she talked and the words that they used, because my people are very Southern, but they still use words from Scotland, even though they had been in this country for 400 years because they were isolated by mountains. So just like different linguistic things that are in your family, I think that adds such richness to how you write and how you think, that are unique to your family, and I think that can be a real gift.
Yes, and your people, like the writers, might be young, so they should ask their parents questions. If they can, they should tape it, and their grandparents. When I was working on my first novel, for many months, I called up my godmother twice a week, and I asked her a lot of questions. And I'm so glad that I did. I have it in notebooks because she has dementia now. Yeah. And if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had it. I used some of the stories. Like I'm going to tell you one story that I use here that's a family story for fun.
Yeah.
It's the one about the pig. Remember the pig?
Yes.
Yeah. Because
you should read that.
Mommy and my godmother. Should I read the story about I don't know that we have time, do we? I don't know how much time we have.
Okay, maybe just summarize it. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, I'm going to tell you the story. Well, in the book, Vicente's father wakes him and his brother up to go to the neighboring farm because that farmer's pigs are eating the vegetables that he's growing in his patch, and he's really pissed off, and the farmer doesn't care. So he gets really angry, and he ends up killing the pig. And then the farmer and his brothers come looking for Vicente's father, and they basically knife him. They leave him for dead at the edge of the road. And a jibaro comes by on his horse and picks him up and takes him to the hospital in another town, and he's saved. Well, that happened to my grandfather. So my godmother and my mother told me that my uncle, his name was my grandfather, his name was Vicente. I named Vicente after my grandfather. So Vicente had a terrible temper, and he was a farmer, and he had a vegetable patch. And the neighbor's pig kept on coming into the vegetable patch, and he's like, "Mira, your pig is eating my," and the farmer didn't care. So he killed the pig, and that farmer and his brothers came looking for him, and they knifed him, and they left him by the edge of the road for dead. This was in the, my godmother said that it was right before World War II. So, and like in the early, for World War II, for America, before America. So I think in the early 1940s, they left him for dead. And somebody happened to come by, picked him up, and took him to the hospital. And for a whole month, he was in the hospital recovering from this, knife wound. And it was very hard for the family because he was the one that, was a farmer provided, and that the neighbors gave food to her mother and to her and a couple of their siblings so that they could survive till he came back.
Wow.
But this is such a good story, I got to use it.
It's a great story, and I would never, that's one of those examples of like truth is stranger than fiction, and you would never think that really happened. I love it. Well, and I'm glad that he survived. That's wow.
Yeah, me too, because I don't think my mother was born yet. I wouldn't be here.
That's great. Well, I feel like we can't top the pig story, so that's a really good place for us to wrap up.
Right.
I'm so grateful for this very generous conversation. I feel like I learned so much, and I know the students did too. I am really excited for more folks to watch this on YouTube with us. If you are watching, I would love for you to purchase the Taste of Sugar from Charis by clicking this teal button at the bottom of your screen. If you feel so inclined, you can make a donation to Charis Circle, which is our nonprofit programming arm. That's how we pay for all of our events and for this platform called Crowdcast that we're using. But overall, we hope that you'll just come back and join us for other events. We hope that you will, support Marisel's work everywhere. And is there any like online space that people can find you in, or anything you want to direct people's attention to in the meantime? I think your screen froze a little. Oh, there you go.
I couldn't remember password. I'm right, so I had to write to. Okay, now?
Yeah.
Am I here?
Yes.
So writing B2 on Instagram, and also I have a website, which is my name, www.mariselvera.com. Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Excellent. Okay.
And just, thank you, students. And
yes, thank you so much. Thank you to Agnes Scott as well for helping us celebrate Latinx Heritage Month. And we will look forward to this third novel from you. I hope that you can maybe come to Charis in person and celebrate with us.
I plan on going to Atlanta next year because my Elena lives in Roswell.
Excellent. Okay.
And also Tiari lives in Atlanta. Tiari said that I could work from a room in her house. So I'm planning on doing that sometime. So I'll make sure that I step by.
That would be lovely. Awesome. Well, until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you so much for this gift of a novel.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Good night.